Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. In light of World Older Persons Day, the UN estimates that by 2030, persons aged over 60 years will be outnumbered the youth across the world. This is seen as one of the most significant transformations of our time. And add to this, the most rapid increase of the elderly will be in the developing world. Now, when talking about the developing world, it is important to also take into consideration those regions that are marred by conflict and how this adds to the complexity of an aging population. On today's show, we take a closer look at what needs to be done for the elderly across developing nations and especially those living in conflict regions. Joining us for this today is Mr. Joseph Cheng, an analyst joining us from Hong Kong, and Mr. Syed Ashtar, an analyst joining us from Delhi. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Cheng, I'd like to begin with you. Now, Hong Kong has its own aging population problem. How much of a challenge is this for the economy?
Well, in the first place, Hong Kong does not have a well-established social security system. So elderly people normally will have to depend on their own savings. Naturally, they are aware of the great power, so to speak, and they would like to demand the government to better provide for them, especially in terms of elderly homes, since for a considerable portion of the elderly population, they do not have enough saving to meet their needs, and they cannot very well depend on their children. So, as you have indicated, a very large segment of the poor population, that is to say, those who are living under the poverty line, comes from elderly people who are single, especially.
Right. Now, Mr. Ashtar, while we're talking those elderly people who live below the poverty line, there is something happening in Kashmir when it comes to that as well. The lockdown continues, medical supplies seem to be in shortage, and the elderly population, of course, would be suffering. Give us a sense of how large of a population in Kashmir lives below the poverty line and relies on reliable infrastructure for their healthcare.
We can say that the majority of the Kashmiri population are above 45, we can say, because after the 90s, the thing we had, the Kashmiri cause we had there, the uprising we had, it affected that time not only the economy but also the health sector, the psychological, mental sector of the Kashmiri people. We can see after the 90s, the Kashmiris were not given so much preferences, not in Kashmir, but not outside the valley. The people born at that time are to be known as children of conflict. We have suffered, the Kashmiri people have suffered a lot. And in recent days, we had a report that about 1.8 million adults in Kashmir Valley showed symptoms of mental distress, out of which 41% of the population showed showed signs of depression, 26% showed signs of anxiety, and 19% showed post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we see the conflict going on in the Kashmir, the elderly people, they also suffered, as well as the youth, as well as the nation, the economy, in every perspective. We all suffered the same. And also, okay, school.
Right. Mr. Ashtar, now just trying to pick up on that point that how the elderly people especially are suffering, the fact that they are more vulnerable to what is happening around them than other groups, those in the younger age categories. Let's watch a little clip of a doctor who was arrested after speaking out about what was happening in Kashmir in regards to the medical facilities.
पहले मैं ये कहना चाहूँगा, ये एहतिजाज नहीं है, ये एक इल्तिजा है हुकूमत से कि बहुत ही जल्दी ये एक ह्यूमैनिटेरियन क्राइसिस बन सकता है कि आपका पूरा हेल्थ केयर सिस्टम, खास तौर पे हमारा हेल्थ इंश्योरेंस स्कीम जो बिलो पॉवर्टी लाइन पेशेंट्स हैं, उनका पूरा फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट ट्रीटमेंट हम हॉस्पिटल, सेंट्रल हॉस्पिटल्स, प्राइवेट हॉस्पिटल्स में अंडर आयुष्मान भारत प्रधानमंत्री जन आरोग्य योजना वी आर एबल टू प्रोवाइड देम फ्री ट्रीटमेंट. लेकिन चूँकि इंटरनेट कनेक्टिविटी नहीं है, फ़ोन लाइन की कनेक्टिविटी नहीं है, हम वो ट्रीटमेंट नहीं प्रोवाइड कर पा रहे हैं पिछले 3 हफ्ते से. इस वजह से हम देख रहे हैं कि कई सारे पेशेंट, मेरे पेशेंट, बाकी डॉक्टर्स के पेशेंट अपने पैसों से खर्च करके अपनी दवाई खरीद रहे हैं, अपने डायलिसिस के लिए, अपने कैंसर कीमोथेरेपी के लिए वो अपना खुद पैसा खर्च कर रहे हैं.
Right here. So, Mr. Ashtar, as we heard the doctor talk about the alarming situation, this was almost at the end of August, and since then, the lockdown continues to persist. How do you think the situation has worsened in Kashmir?
Well, as of now, I have been here in the capital in Delhi for a week. So as soon as I came here, I saw posts on internet that Kashmiri youth or Kashmiri people living outside the valley, they had put stories, they have put posts on their social media accounts that they want, that they have medicine that they want to be reached immediately in Kashmir, because they are getting news from Kashmir that the people, that their family members, their near and dears, they are not getting the medicine because all the valley is short of medicine. So what we Kashmiri people outside Kashmir are doing every day, almost every day, we have a local gathering points here where we go and we see that is anyone among us going to the Kashmir. So we have mainly is the medicines that is to be reached Kashmir, because there is no availability of medicine right now. And the other thing, which is the most concerning right now, the medicines which Kashmir, which basically Kashmir, which are in Kashmir, they are expired. There have been cases, but they are not reported so widely. The medicines using the government hospitals or sub-district hospitals, they are mostly expired.
And Mr. Ashtar, where are you getting this information from, that the medicines being provided there are expired?
Yes. I myself, when I was in Kashmir about a week ago, we were outside this medical hospital. We went there for, we had something going on in our neighborhood. So we went to the hospital and there was a small protest gathering. There was a patient who was crying here and there that I got the medicines from the counter and it's expired. How could I give this medicine to my near ones? They are dying outside there. They are dying outside in here. So I have witnessed myself that there are these expired medicines, because what's going on in Kashmir, it not only affected us, it also affected the medical supplies which come and go to the valley, because the highway is closed, because the movement is not so done, because the medical supplies in India, they don't send their medicines to the valley because they know the situation in the valley is not good, so their money will not come back. The people have no job. They're from past 2 months they are at their homes.
Right.
There's no money coming and going. So
Right.
that's like
And
from India, from the private organizers, private medical, they have limited it.
Right. Mr. Ashtar, will continue to talk about how the conflict is unfolding and how various groups are suffering. But before that, I want to talk to Mr. Cheng a little more about the opportunities that come with investing in the aging population. We talk a lot about the challenges, but are there any opportunities for the economy?
Well, in the first place, the government normally has to consider how to provide for the elderly well in advance. In a place like Hong Kong and in many Asian cities and Asian countries, some kind of universal pension system, some kind of long-term universal medical insurance system, etc., are necessary to ensure that the elderly people are being provided for. And I think elderly people today understand that they cannot depend on the children in the traditional manner. They should be encouraged to save, and the finance industry should also provide for schemes available for people of various levels of economic means to save, to invest, so as to provide for their old age, which is becoming longer and longer. On a more positive note, I think countries like Japan and Singapore are thinking of enabling the elderly people to continue working for a longer period of time, that is to say, to retire a bit later, which will make good use of their talents as well as to reduce the expenditure on pensions and elderly care.
Right. On that note of talking about how there is a need for investment in the elderly population and how they shouldn't have to rely on their children, Mr. Ashtar, I want to talk about something that's unique to the Kashmiri context here. Now, reports by the United Nations, various NGOs state how an increasing number of young men and boys are being detained. And of course, this has a toll on the family structures. How do you think this impacts the families, and especially those old parents who have relied on their children for so long?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, as we were talking about these NGOs, the United Nations reports, there only a week ago there was this women-led team, who had some research done in the Kashmir about this detained thing from the 5th of August, and the number they gave out here was 13,000. 13,000 boys have been picked up by the Indian authorities, and their parents, they don't know where are they. So, they have no contact about them. The army or the police is giving nothing about them, about their whereabouts. So when we see to it, it's not only the 13,000 detainees, it's the 13,000 family members which have been affected. And out of which there was a study done by Medicine Sans Frontier. It said that 11.6% of the Kashmiri women, the cases we have studied, apart from the trauma, depression and stress, the 11.6% of these victims, we can say adult women, they have been victims of sexual abuse. So you can see the traumatic level, the stress level, the depression Kashmiri people are there, because when they say that, when they see that their youth, that their children are out there, they are in the conflict and they don't know what's going to happen, what's going next to happen, and how could it have an impact on them. So we can say that it has a very bad impact, trauma, depression, which is rising, and which the most commonly, the depression rate in the women are in India, is found in the Indian administered Kashmir. Right. So the conflict has took the toll on the Kashmiri elderly people.
Right. Of course, with that. Thank you so much, Mr. Syed Ashtar, for joining us and talking to us. We're now joined by Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghani, who's a Syrian activist, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ghani. Now, Mr. Ghani, while we're talking about the Syrian context and conflict going on there, tell us more about how the elderly are more vulnerable in these settings. What is the cost to them? We've talked a lot about how young activists suffer, how the youth suffer, but specifically in this context, how are the elderly suffering?
I think Syria is the worst in the world in this regard because, as you know, like about 13 million of Syrians forcibly displaced interiorly or be refugees. Lots of, like the majority of those are youth, like the elder, like almost stay, refuse to join to their children or to their, even the elder refuse to displace inside Syria. So they almost stay and this actually, so that their children be apart from, like very far from them, they are unable. Like almost the youth in Syria refuse to be back to the regime area because they might be arrested or disappeared or tortured, or the regime actually recruit them again, forced to recruit them again in his army. And we have a research in this regard, and we found that the regime arrest about 2,000 persons when they return back from the refugees, and even from the displaced area when the regime seized those areas. So this caused this disaster situation for those elders. This is from the first hand. Then from the second hand, in the economic side, now the elder engage again in manage their life because, as I mentioned, the youth and their children also be away from them. So they now take care about themselves, maybe their wife as well, and that's so difficult. And when the elder be a female, and her husband maybe disappeared, and her children also be far away. So that's more difficulties from the gender side as well. She'll take care for herself. Actually, it's so difficult to talk about the deportation between the families. Even
Right.
for example, in some neighbor country, the family is also segregated between each other.
Right. Now, Mr. Cheng, as Mr. Ghani, Mr. Ashtar both highlighted in conflict zones how the elderly have to become more self-reliant because of the toll that it takes on the youth, on the younger generations. Trying to link that to what is happening in Hong Kong with the aging population and how you talked about there being an opportunity with the elderly, they can join the workforce. What additional investment is needed by the government? Because the elderly in many cases are out of touch with technology, with certain programs. What needs to be done in order to make them more productive?
There are two types of programs necessary. One type is a kind of channels for them to remain in contact with the society so that they are aware of job opportunities, so that they stay in contact with various types of community organizations, with their neighbors, and so on. The other type of programs will largely be educational, so much so that they may learn how to use the internet, how to use various channels to seek information, to keep themselves informed, to remain competent and active in the labor force, and so on. Basically, these programs should not be too costly, and they should be made more widespread. They should be, and the elderly people should be made aware of these programs. A kind of social service network, well established and reaching to the grassroots level, should be the key to allow these two types of programs to be established and to be effective and fruitful.
Right. And how well is Hong Kong coming on that path in doing all of this and implementing these programs?
One has to rely on the government to provide funding. Fortunately, the Hong Kong government is rich enough to do that. But I think in East Asia and in places like Hong Kong, various voluntary bodies are being used, so to speak. Various types of religious bodies, churches and monasteries naturally are quite ready to provide these services. And above all else, it is important to establish the grassroots network so that ordinary people should be able to come to help and to spread the information. Voluntary work should be encouraged, and I think this is becoming more and more widespread, and it is important to cultivate the sense of satisfaction among ordinary people so that when they deliver voluntary services, they get a sense of satisfaction. They feel that they have been doing something good, they have made a contribution. And I think this is important. It is very much a part of civil society developing.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Cheng, for joining us and talking to us. We're now joined by Ms. Maram Susli, who's a Syrian activist joining us from Perth. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Susli. Now, while we're talking about the vulnerable populations and how important certain infrastructure is for their healthcare, for their well-being, now talking about conflict zones, of course, the systems are completely shattered. In this case, how important is it for these people to have reliable infrastructure in terms of healthcare? And what is the state right now that we're witnessing?
Well, before the war began in Syria in 2011, Syria was pretty much 98% self-sufficient, produced all its own drugs. Healthcare was free. But the war has caused so much damage to so many hospitals, the pharmaceutical industry, the factories, doctors as well. A lot of them have left the country. to Europe and Germany. So this has led to not only the cost of medicine increasing, but the amount of availability of medicine to decrease as well. And especially for children who have cancer, because of all the medication that Syria has been able to produce for itself using its own technology, much of the cancer drugs for leukemia is not within Syria's capability of producing. And unfortunately, sanctions on Syria has made it very, very difficult to treat children with cancer. These sanctions are being placed on oncology medication as well as other medications. So for Syria to be able to get back on its feet, obviously sanctions are going to need to be lifted, and some money is going to be needed to rebuild that infrastructure that was lost during the war.
The indiscriminate targeting of civilians and infrastructure. Of course, it's seen that only society can progress or get back to normal, rehabilitate itself after the war has ended. But before that, what do you think can be done? What do you think needs to be done in terms of this indiscriminate killing, this indiscriminate targeting, and ruining civilian infrastructures? What lines need to be drawn here right now during the conflict?
Well, whether it's indiscriminate or not is arguable. And I think there's a certain level of one-sided blindness going on here. There have been records of recently this year, the rebels bombing Syrian government-held areas with chemical weapons. And of course, the United Nations hasn't given any side the responsibility for that. But if the question is, if the idea is that the US is imposing sanctions on Syria for humanitarian reasons, this is completely naive. The US has destroyed Raqqa. It has bombed Syria's oil infrastructure. It's occupying Syrian land, preventing Syria from accessing its own oil. And of course, there's water shortages as well.
Since we're running short on time, I do want to talk about, again, what can be done right now, what needs to be done. You're saying that it's arguable what the civilian casualties are, but we do see that there are civilian casualties. What needs to be done in terms of setting certain boundaries?
If talking about infrastructure, then we have to talk about economy. We have to end the occupation, allow Syria to regain control of its own resources, water, oil, food, agriculture, and end the sanctions as well. That's the only way to rebuild infrastructure. In terms of the war, basically we need civilian corridors open for civilians to get out of rebel-held territory, because as we know, Al-Qaeda is in control of Idlib. The US has admitted this. So we need safety corridors and end of sanctions.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Maram Susli, for joining, Mr. Fadel, Abdul Ghani for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we just take a closer look at how stress impacts child development and whether some forms of stress are in fact necessary for a healthy development. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, all parents, and rightfully so, want to create a safe environment for their children. That's what parents do. But with a noticeable rise in parenting styles such as the hovering parent and intensive parenting, are the lines between what it means to be caring and involved and what it is to be overprotective and intrusive being blurred? We take a closer look at the story. Joining us for this discussion today is Ms. Ayesha Sheeraz, a psychologist joining us in the Lahore studios. Also joining us is Mr. Dean Russell, Advisory Director for Parliament Street, joining us from London. Ms. Enakshi Ganguly, child rights activist, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Russell, I'd like to begin with you. Now, you have conducted extensive research onto the factors as to what contributes to the stress of young adults and children. Do you feel that children today are more stressed out than, let's say, 10 years ago?
I think there's definitely that's the case. I think there's so many more inputs now and so many places that children get information from. When we look at technology in particular, the access to apps, to mobile, to social media, And I think the challenge now, especially as children are starting to get older and starting to form friendships and relationships, it's harder for parents to monitor, or at least it's perceived for the parents to find it harder. And that adds extra stress to parenting. So I think you then end up with this issue of what are called helicopter parents, who are watching every last move. But I also think we're in a situation now where in the past, we could identify when children were, say, lonely, and that was affecting their stress and their mental health. And we used to sort of use the phrase, when people are lonely in a crowd. And now I'd say people are lonely in the cloud. They're lonely, but they're online. They're using social media, but they're not necessarily socializing. And I think the constructs around society, around culture, around community have changed dramatically, but invisibly. And so I think for parents who grew up like myself in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where actually the inputs were mainly the television, cinema, music, going to concerts, especially as we got much older, but even for really young kids, that's changed now. The inputs are massively increased, phenomenally increased. And so parents, I don't think, are totally sure what inputs are going to their children. And also, I think, with the rise of social media, with the rise of the internet, where you can get advice on anything from anybody, we're now in a situation where I think parents feel more judged. I think they're conscious all the time of doing the wrong thing. They're constantly seeing a new celebrity trend, we see it with diets, for example, over many years. And now that's affecting children in terms of anorexia, increasingly so, in terms of food habits and so on. And I think we have to be really careful that we don't allow this to become a much bigger issue, and especially the younger children are getting, because kids now at a very young age are on things like WhatsApp. And actually, they're looking to their peers who are young kids to advise them, and it might not necessarily be the best advice.
Right. Now, Mr. Russell very comprehensively outlined for us the various reasons as to why children might be more stressed out today. And he highlights technology as being one of the main causes for it.
I agree.
But take us through what really happens to the development of a child from a young age. Now, children who have access to the internet from a young age, we talk about screen time causing anxiety and depression, various other things. But what happens to their development because of all of these stresses?
It's very important that I'm going to second Mr. Russell, that he very rightly pointed out that majority of people, the children, especially of the young age, they have this overexposure towards the internet, to this technology, what we're going to say. And it's very important to keep a balance of everything. You see, where these technologies are very beneficial for the children's development, where they are being exposed to the worldwide knowledge, where we were not when we were young. We had to, sort of consult people it used to take a lot of time if we had to even write a project. But now children know how they have to do, how they have to make the projects. The most important and the catch is that how you have to keep a balance as a parent. Somehow, yes, we parents are becoming overprotective because we also know, we are aware of the facts, how detrimental effects this technology has to these children, and how we have to convince our children, to keep up, again, a balance of your work life, of your school life, and how you have to use this technology wisely. It's very important that parents should discuss the pros and cons of using this technology, because the research today is showing that majority of the children who are suffering from depression and anxiety, one of the very significant reason is overprotective parenting, number one, and number two, the overuse of technology, the over access of internet to these children. Even the younger child is holding, a very young child is holding a tablet or a laptop and is engaging, because parents are more like, if they're working, they're going to give their telephone to their very young child, and it's so that the child is engaged and is busy with that thing, so the parents can do. It's very important that the children should be taught how to use this technology and how long they should be using by using the principles of what we call in psychology, principles of reinforcement, punishment, how we can strengthen a behavior through reinforcement, how we can weaken up behavior through punishment.
Sheeraz, now from all of this, you are telling us what parents need to do. But when we're going back to the child and talking about how a stressful environment, and that's what overprotective parents would probably want to do, try to protect a child from that environment. How can that also create additional stresses for the child?
101%. You see, there are various forms of stresses. You have to identify that thing first. There are positive stresses, there are negative stresses. Positive stresses are just which are very short term, and sometimes these stresses help the children to develop coping skills, which are quite essential for the child, a growing child, how to deal with the life, typical life stresses such as dealing with sibling rivalry, having relationship issues at the school, changing the school. But there are many other going through some injuries. However, what is important is a supportive parenting, a supportive, nurturing guidance from the parents is very much required. However, negative stress, what is negative stress? If the stress becomes prolonged, the child is exposed to long-term chronic stress, neglect, abuse, anything of that sort, without the parental support, without the adult support, that becomes chronic. And that affects the child's overall brain development, physical development, cognitive development, psychological development. It affects the child's overall personality throughout their life.
Right. Now, Ms. Sheeraz, you rightfully outlined for us what happens when a parent is overprotective and the environment that is created with that. Ms. Ganguly, what I want to talk to you about is the opposite end of the spectrum. Now, child neglect, and that too, many people would say, is increasing with the busy lifestyles that parents are now adopting. These are both two trends that are contradictory, but they're almost increasing side by side. How does that impact a child's development?
It is also what we have been hearing from Dr. Russell and Dr. Sheeraz are so important, because what we are looking at is parents also struggling with how to balance work life and children in their own lives. So I do not think that they deliberately always want to neglect the child. It's just that they are under such tremendous pressure. The bottom line, and I think the most important thing that we are missing out today in our days of so much communication on other forms of communication rather than just talking, is communication. It's so important that parents and children are able to sit down and talk. And if the parents could explain to the children why they are busy, I am sure children would understand. But it's not that they're deliberately always neglecting them. It's just that they have the pressures of their lives and the pressures of the children's lives are all contributing to a feeling of abandonment that many of the children that we work with are growing up with, which is a matter of great concern. And because they feel abandoned, they seek friendships online, which puts them into a danger and harm through online abuse. So it's a vicious cycle that these children are facing, which we need to interrupt and break into very, very soon. Otherwise, everything that Dr. Russell and Dr. Sheeraz said is what's going to be happening to the children.
Right. Now, Mr. Russell, Ms. Ganguly cited a very essential point here, something that, of course, was very important to remember, that parents themselves are also struggling. And that's why if we witness certain extremes, it's a manifestation of that struggle. I do want to talk to you about what structural changes at a large scale need to happen in order to support new parents helping them manage their work-life balance. What can be done by state authorities, by the community?
I think there's quite a few things, actually. I mean, we do live in this 24/7 culture, and sadly that 24/7 culture is shifting to be much more work than play. And, you know, I know myself as a parent, you know, I've been very fortunate that my daughter from a young age has been very good at going to bed at the right time. You know, she actively tells me when she wants to switch off from using technology. But I know that's not always the case with kids. And I think the challenge for parents is that I think they need to listen to themselves, but also listen to their children. There was a great quote someone told me many, many years ago, which I've stuck to, which is that always listen to your children when they tell you about the little things when they're young, Because otherwise, if you don't listen to the little things when they're young, why will they tell you the big things as they grow up? And I think sometimes as a parent, we can use FaceTime, we can use technology. I mean, I wrote 4 children's books when I was young, when my daughter was very young, and got those published, because it was something that we could do together. And I think, children, I don't think they necessarily want things. They want time. And that is hard to do. But I think if kids know that you will spend an hour with them on a weekday doing something rather than just sitting watching TV, that at the weekend
right, but
take time
Mr.
and
Russell,
not check
going
your
back to that point, how you were also mentioning that it is more work than play now. What can be done to give support to these parents who are juggling their lives with children? What needs to be done in order to somehow create a more healthy work-life balance?
I think there's many things, one of which is within the workplace. I think people need to realize that, if people aren't performing or rather doing what they love doing, they're not going to perform as well with it. So actually, if you are tired as a parent, if you are working, and not just as a parent, just generally in life, if you aren't performing to be the best person that you can be the best that you are, then actually you're not going to do as well at it. And I think within work now, there's very much this idea, and a lot of businesses, expect you to be chained to the desk early in the morning, then chained to your phone late at night, to be available for email. And I think there's a cultural shift now. Flexible working, the ability to work from home, all of those things are now available. But I think the catch is that it's turned slightly the wrong way at times, that flexible working doesn't necessarily mean you get more time off with your kids. It means you've got more time to work when you're with your kids. And so I think we need to really address that. And employers, have an opportunity to do that, not because it's just the right thing to do, but actually
and Mr. Russell, that's a very important to make about how even with all these flexibilities, that doesn't necessarily mean that the parent gets to spend more time with the child. Now, Ms. Sheeraz, jumping a little from this conversation and talking about how children need to experience things, and this is something we've also said it while growing up, let us have our own experiences, don't impose your own judgments on us.
I agree.
How important is it for children to also encounter negative experiences in their lives?
Oh, I think that's very important. Unless until you do not experience the contrast of 2 consequences, I think you would never be able to learn and observe what is right and what is wrong. I think that's very, very important. The child should. There are things, even with the simplest thing, if the child wants to buy a certain thing, let the child buy. Even it as a parent, it is a wrong choice. Let them. So the child, when the child is going to experience going home that it wasn't worth it, so the next time, I'm sure, as being a psychologist, majority of the time, children do learn how to make the right decisions, right choices later on in their life. I think that's very, very important. And then, as discussed earlier, the quality of communication, the quality of time spent with the child is very, very crucial. I think these are the very significant points that needs to be mentioned here.
Right.
So that's what my point of view on this.
Ms. Ganguly, now, while we're talking about what needs to be done by the parents for this support, we know as children grow older, they spend more and more time in school institutions with their friends and in universities. What external support is needed by the society in order to make sure that these children have a healthy mindset and a healthy mental state?
It's a gamut of things that we are looking at. We're not looking at any one thing. You're talking about an ecosystem approach, and an ecosystem approach that allows for multiple kinds of people. What I'm finding increasingly that children are afraid of is something called othering. It's a terminology that means that you are not like me, you are like somebody else. And so a lot of young people spend a lot of time, the reason that they are anorexic or they are so afraid of looking different or behaving different, or is because they don't want to be othered. They do not want to be like they want to be part of the crowd. So I think the society has become very much more judgmental and non-inclusive than when we were growing up in many ways. So it is inclusiveness of different kinds of people, of different levels of intelligence, different kinds of characteristics, ability, disability, different kinds of looks, all need to be part of our growing up and the ecosystem that is being created around us through the political discourse that is in the countries, through the societal discourse that is in the countries, kind of literature that we are putting out, the kind of movies we are putting out, the kind of television shows we are putting out. It cannot be just one thing. We cannot expect...
Ganguly, and you're making such an essential point here, and this is something I do want to ask you. While you're talking about the political climate and how that even feeds into child rearing, the factors that children are exposed to, some would argue that it's just children who belong to certain segments of society who will suffer from this. But do you think that with hostile factors, even those children who are more sheltered, more privileged, will suffer from all of this?
It's an environment that makes the human being. How you grow up in the kind of discourse that goes around you creates the kind of thinking you are in. And globally, as you can see, there is much more violence that one is witnessing in the political environment, much more intolerance of different kinds of differences. So unless we create that environment, which is social, political, environmental, even the love for the environment, all of that becomes part of the growing up of a child, and that they will imbibe it and they will live it, and this is what they will be, and this is and therefore that they should not feel threatened to be different or feel less is a very important part, because children who feel less grow up feeling grow up with low self-esteem, and that's when they hide behind computers and internet.
And that's an essential point that you're making there, Ms. Ganguly, that when children feel like they have a lower self-esteem, they hide behind different things, whether it's social media, whether it's media, staying at home, being more isolated on that point. Thank you so much for joining us and talking to us, Ms. Ganguly. Mr. Russell, you also mentioned this earlier in the conversation, how social media and media is playing into what we're seeing, children being more stressed out, more depressed, more anxious. And Ms. Ganguly talked about how self-esteem also is connected with all of this. What regulations do you think need to be imposed on these social media platforms specifically in order to make them more tolerant for children who are using them?
Well, first of all, I think, especially for younger children, they shouldn't really be using them. I mean, part of being fitting into a social community is you learn those skills over time. And I think social media, in a way, is sort of hijacking that. And I'm not against social media by any means. It just delivered much good to the world. But I think this concept, and I've not heard the term before, but this concept of othering is fascinating, because as a society, we do have this very strange thing of wanting to be part of the crowd. Yet all the people who have ever been successful are the people who rejected the crowd and did their own thing. I mean, the idea that a Richard Branson or a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs would be where they eventually got to or continue to be because they followed the crowd is rather crazy. So I think this idea that we've created this society which is very tribalistic in terms of tribes online. You can choose to only listen to voices that agree with you. I think the point earlier about this idea of enabling failure and enabling sort of opposite voices is absolutely critical. We've got to make sure that we have a society and a dynamic online which doesn't turn into this awful trolling, but does allow this concept of being able to debate and argue
Right. And
civilly.
Mr. Russell, and as you're mentioning here, thank you for joining us and talking to us, Mr. Dean Russell. And as he mentioned here, the climate online, whether it's trolling, whether it's criticism, is becoming more harsh. And this is the point I do want to end the show on. It's inevitable that children will face stress. But how should they process, and how should parents help them process those negative emotions?
As I mentioned earlier, I think the quality of relationship, quality of communication is the most important thing that is lacking today. This 24/7 culture that was even talked by Mr. Russell, he said it's basically a very challenging as a parent to have a very consistent and a very persistent sort of a parenting, even if he realizes is that these are the things that we need to correct, we need to implement, or we need to put them into the structural rule book in the house. But it's very difficult to maintain that thing, being consistent with the child.
Right.
However, I think giving an unconditional positive regard to the child, treating the child not as a child but as an individual growing human being, I think that's the most important thing. Listening to the most important, the most smallest thing,
minute
the child is minute,
right.
giving attention to the minute details. And sometimes children are unable to express what they're feeling. They give you physical symptoms,
right,
which are more psychosomatic in nature, they're more psychological in nature. You have to be mindful rather the child is giving you any stress or anxiety symptoms through.
And Ms. Sheeraz, that point on trying to respect children as individuals and not just merely seeing them as children, I think is the takeaway from all of this, that parents need to deal with children as, people, as persons.
And unconditional positive regard.
An unconditional positive regard. Well, we're going to have to leave the segment at that. Thank you so much, Ms. Syeda, Ayesha, Sheeraz, for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.